The United Nations Marquee Climate Summit is well underway. It's the annual opportunity for countries to come together and set climate targets aimed at slowing global warming. The focus this year is squarely on fossil fuels and when and how, in some cases even if, to phase them out. To that point, this year's meetings are taking place in oil-rich Dubai, hosted by an oil executive leader and populated by a record number of fossil fuel lobbyists. Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber, who is hosting the summit, said that there's no science to supporting reducing fossil fuels to slow climate change, though this week he insisted those comments were taken out of context. Alberta's Danielle Smith is also in Dubai, promoting her province's market and pitching carbon capture technology as the vehicle to green the industry. Have a listen to our conversation with Alberta's Premier. Hi, Premier Smith. Good to have you back on the show. Thanks for making the time.
My pleasure.
Right before you left, Premier, you announced a tax credit to incentivize investment in carbon capture. And from what I've seen and read of your time at COP, you spent a lot of your time there talking about that technology alongside oil and gas executives. The 6 companies, though, that Pathways Alliance represents had a banner year in 2022, doubling their profits from the year before. Why are taxpayers footing any of the bill for them to lower emissions?
Well, what I'd say is that we own the resource. Now, the Alberta government and Albertans own the resource, 85% of it. And we ask the energy companies to develop the resource on our behalf. And we get a lot of revenue as a result of it. I think this year, in combination, our royalty revenue, as well as our revenue from corporate income tax, along with personal income tax, is somewhere in the order of $20 billion. And so if we can incentivize the construction of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, so we can have the best barrels and the greenest barrels and ensure that that revenue stream continues for the next 20, 30, 40 years or more, then it seems to me it's a pretty good investment.
But your royalty revenues, let's say from a provincial perspective, you said $20 billion. Their profits, combined just profits in 2022, was $35 billion. The outside assessment I saw of how much they then invested into efforts to reduce emissions in the same year was about $500 million. So again, how can you justify to Alberta taxpayers who are already facing an affordability crisis that more of their money should help out companies making profits that size?
Well, I think the danger is if we don't aspire to have the greenest barrel, if we don't have a massive reduction in emissions, and Pathways in particular wants to be net zero by 2050. If we don't do that and we see emissions caps come in that cap production and shut in production, that will cost us millions of barrels and billions of dollars. And that's what we're aiming to do, is we're aiming to partner with industry so that we can invest jointly on ensuring the prosperity and longevity of this industry. And I was actually pleased to see that the federal government is also matching the approach by also offering an investment tax credit so that we can be the first in the world to really deploy this on a major scale.
And I remember asking the exact same questions of them when they made that announcement. And do I interpret from what you just said that you don't think industry would have done it on its own? And what does that say about the true commitment of the oil patch to reducing emissions, if that's the case?
Well, any industry is going to invest in those kinds of things that make the money. And the energy industry invests in the production of natural gas, production of oil, production of bitumen, because they can sell it on the market. There really isn't a revenue stream that you can earn from capturing CO2, building a pipeline, burying it underground. It's a huge cost. But the cost is, as I look at it, ought to be shared by the federal government that is mandating greater and greater emissions reduction. And the province, as the owner of the resource, we've got to be responsible on it. And the industry partners, I look at it as a 3-way partnership. And so if we can work together on getting the emissions abated so that we can sell our product to the world and they can follow suit, I think that's a pretty good compromise.
What assurances can you provide taxpayers in Alberta that they will get a return on that investment, that the money that you're offering to incentivize the construction, the development of carbon capture at the scale that is necessary to reach targets will actually happen? What kind of accountability is tied to the up to $5 billion of taxpayer money you're prepared to provide these companies?
Well, we don't provide any dollars until the project is up and running and working. They have to have the emissions flowing through either to some kind of utilization purpose, because there are increasing use cases, but in this case, it will most likely be to storage. And so it depends on when they complete the project, but I think they're looking at making a final investment decision by 2025, beginning the construction, we would hope, sometime after that. And so we'll be waiting to see and make sure that the project gets complete. That's the way that we ensure that no taxpayer dollars are spent on chasing a project that doesn't happen. This project has to happen in order for the dollars to flow.
And it has to be completed in order for the full dollars to flow? And what
That's correct. That's how we're working it with the Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program. Dow Chemical, as you probably saw, also announced the first net zero petrochemical plants. The first time in the world we're going to have green plastics, and it works very much the same way. We won't give them the rebate on a percentage of their capital cost until it's up and running and they're producing the first product.
Do you have evidence that that scale of carbon capture will work to the degree that your government and the oil patch is saying that it will? And I ask because a recent report from the International Energy Agency said limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050 would require, quote, inconceivable levels of carbon capture. What do you know that the IEA does not?
Well, I don't think the IEA has taken a look at Alberta, which has some of the best pore space and best geology in the entire world. Our assessment through Alberta Innovates suggests that we have, at a minimum, the ability to capture and sequester 100 billion tons of CO2. Keep in mind, Canada's entire contribution is 760 million tons a year. So we have the ability to capture the emissions for Canada multiple times over for hundreds of years. So that's why I have confidence that it is a solution for Alberta. And what I like about it, too, is it's not just an energy sector solution. We're going to have decarbonized plastics, as I mentioned, with petrochemicals. Heidelberg is going to have a net zero cement plant next year, the first one in the world. We also have net zero hydrogen with Air Products. I hope that we'll be able to attract a net zero steel plant, because then when we can create net zero building materials across the entire supply chain, that allows us to decarbonize on a whole range of fronts. So I'm feeling very optimistic about Alberta's ability to solve this problem, not only for us, but for the country and perhaps for the world.
Ability, though, is different, with great respect, Premier, than reality. And I'll read to you something from a recent report from the Institute of Sustainable Development to get your reaction to this. There are 7 CCS projects currently operating in Canada, mostly in the oil and gas sector, capturing about 0.5% of national emissions. Based on available data, projects operating in the oil and gas sector in Canada capture approximately 1.3% of the sector's pre-pandemic emissions and 2.6% of the reductions needed for the sector to contribute a fair share to the national 2030 target of a 40 to 45% reduction below 2005 levels. We're at 2.6%, a fraction of where it needs to be. The scale, the scope of what you're talking about is feasible, is not nothing. And I'm wondering, again, I'll circle back to my original question, have you seen evidence that that kind of scale will actually be effective in doing what you say it will?
Well, there is a benefit that comes from being the first in the market, and Saskatchewan sees it too. Saskatchewan has already sequestered 40 megatons. We have already sequestered 11.5 megatons with our Quest and Carbon Trunk Line, and we're very far ahead of other jurisdictions. That's one of the things I learned by being in COP. We spent $30 million mapping out our pore space. We've got 25 hubs that are under license, and we've got major proponents that are building the various carbon trunk lines that we're going to need. So,
but it's all just in its infancy. It's all just in its infancy. And in previous carbon capture projects in Alberta, lots of stuff didn't end up going through. There are other projects in which there was great promise and it never ended up being fulfilled.
This is why I was delighted that the federal government joined us in announcing the carbon capture utilization and storage tax credit that they did. They'll be rebating 50% of the capital cost. We'll be rebating 12% of the capital cost. They're also going to be doing contracts for differences, which also provides some price security. We have a program that allows for companies to be able to monetize the savings that they have on CO2, which helps with their operating costs as well. So none of these things existed before. But the fact that the technology has been proven out, that Alberta and Saskatchewan are miles ahead of anyone else, and that we're seeing companies make the decision with their investment dollars in their final investment decisions, I think that this is going to move very quickly. And that's why I'm excited about it. But this is also why we've set a 2050 target. You're probably quite right that having all of this in place by 2030 probably isn't feasible, but having it in place by 2050 absolutely is. So I think that carbon capture, utilization, and storage is going to be a major solution for Canada.
So are you saying, though, with great respect, Premier, that Albertans and Canadians are just supposed to hope things happen over the next 25 years? I mean, without putting in any kind of target for 2030, doesn't your government escape any real accountability?
Well, they just have to watch us. I mean, the fact that you've got Air Products that is already in process on building their hydrogen plant, and it will be up and running, I believe, by 2026. Heidelberg will be making their investment announcement next year and hope to have their plant in operation by 2026. We also have the petrochemical, Dow Chemical. They're going to be up and running by 2027. You're going to see those major industries capturing and burying CO2 within a few short years.
So then why not set a target for? So then why not set a target for accountability?
Well, look, I can't rush the technology along. We know that there's a permitting process you have to go through, First Nations negotiations and discussion. So we have to assemble the land. We have to go through the regulatory process at the provincial and federal level, include municipal partners, determine the route, get it built, and start sequestering. And I don't know if you've watched how long it takes to get any major project built in this country, but trying to presuppose that can all be engineered and completed in 7 years, I think that's wildly optimistic. We're going to work towards it. I hope that the federal government will work with us on streamlining the approval process so we can get there faster. But we have to be also working in the world of real timelines. And I think real timelines operate on a scale that's somewhat longer than that.
Just before I let you go, Premier, I did want to ask you, you mentioned the emissions cap. The federal environment minister had signaled that he would sort of, you know, there's a draft almost out there. They've floated a number, and he signaled that there would be some sort of concrete announcement during COP. Has he communicated that to you? And do you plan, if it does match what the drafts were, to invoke the Sovereignty Act once again?
You know, he said that he would give us a policy briefing if we agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which is bananas. I mean, if you're going to behave in a way that is consistent with what the Supreme Court has said about cooperative federalism, you don't take unilateral action in an area of a province's jurisdiction. So I'm appalled that he's decided to come to COP and showboat that way. We've been working in a way that we thought was collaborative about working towards a 2050 target, and he's rejected our approach on that. So I'll wait along with everybody else to see what the details are, but I can tell you this, a production cap is not on. If the emissions cap is so stringent that it would result in shutting in production, we're just simply not going to let that happen. It would be a violation of the Constitution, and we'll fight it tooth and nail.
Do you believe that invoking the Sovereignty Act when you have already speaks to that spirit, as you describe it, of collaboration?
They're the ones starting it. Like we're acting in a way that I think is consistent with the law, consistent with the Constitution, and consistent with what the Supreme Court has said. What I find appalling is that the federal government is acting like the Supreme Court hasn't admonished them twice, and they have. They are not permitted to treat us like we are some lower order of government. We are an equivalent level of government. We have certain areas of jurisdiction. They have certain areas of jurisdiction. It would be no more appropriate for me to start legislating in federal jurisdiction, acting unilaterally, than what they're doing to us. So I would say that we can work together. I think we've demonstrated that we can. The fact that we were partners in helping to move all three of those projects with Heidelberg, with Air Products, and with Dow Chemical to the finish line shows we can work together when we're doing with the spirit of collaboration. But coming to COP to showboat and do unilateral announcements, that I don't think is keeping with that spirit. That's why we've got to fight back against it.
There is one, just last question, I know your time is limited. There is one Supreme Court decision, though, that does support the idea of the federal government imposing some sort of rules or regulations around the issue of climate change. And that's the first one on the price of carbon, in which the Chief Justice Richard Wagner said that the federal government is free to impose minimum pricing standards because the threat of climate change is so great and that it demands a coordinated national approach.
Well, and this is, I guess, the question. Do we have a coordinated national approach now when they're making carve-outs in Atlantic Canada because it's politically expedient to do so? There's a separate set of rules in Quebec than there is anywhere else. I would say that if the argument was that there needed to be the same price applied the same way in every jurisdiction, then perhaps they might have a leg to stand on. But that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about having a very specific program designed to hit a very specific province and a very specific industry. That's the oil and gas sector in Alberta, principally. And that's why we think that the court will see through this as a way of trying to intervene in our jurisdiction. I think they'll stand on our side, and we're willing to test that.
Okay, Premier, I'll leave it there. I appreciate your time today very much. Thank you.
Thank you.